You're listening to Southpod, Rise of a Region, hosted by Stanfield Gray and John Yarian.
Welcome to Southpod. I am John Yarian, your host, and this is our first recording post-conference, Big South 2018. So we are sad and lonely and waiting for the next one to come around. But in the meantime, David Rose is here to cheer us up and help us learn a little bit in the meantime. He is a serial entrepreneur, a super angel investor, an author, a thought leader, a futurist. David, how do you self-identify?
Entrepreneur. First and foremost, absolutely. Ben Franklin, one of our founding fathers and the inventor of all kinds of things, first postmaster general, amazing kind of guy, signer of the Declaration and everything else, wrote his own epitaph to be put on his tombstone. And he wrote it, "Here lies Benjamin Franklin, printer." So his self-image was as a businessman, a printer. That was his first vocation when he apprenticed his brother and then started his own. He printed Poor Richard's Almanac and so on and so forth. By the way, Franklin's one of my heroes. But throughout his entire life, despite having invented 6,000 things and being one of the founding fathers of the country, his self-identification was as a printer, as a businessman entrepreneur. By the same token, even though I spend probably these days much of my time writing, teaching, investing, pontificating, answering Quora questions, doing podcasts, and so on and so forth, without question, I self-identify as an entrepreneur. So here's David S. Rose, entrepreneur.
Well, there's humor in this, but I can tell you're very serious about that. There's something in this that you're quite committed to, and I wonder what's the problem with the rest of the titles. Is that a distraction? What does it mean for you to have such a distilled way of describing or thinking about yourself?
Well, I mean, a lot of this has to do with both self-image, who you are and how you think of yourself. And so there's a whole lot of stuff in the literature about entrepreneurship. Can you teach it? Can you become one? Is it genetic? Is it psychiatric? Is it whatever, right? And, I don't have the definitive answer on that. I think it's very clear based on my lifetime in this business that there is a very large extent that is predetermined to some way. And I write about that in my book and some of the courses I've taught. So I think you have to have something that you were born with, whether it is genetic or psychiatric or whatever else. And there's a lot to do beyond that has to do with environment and upbringing and role models and, so on and so forth. But so in my estimation, having spent a lifetime now being one, investing in one's teaching and so on and so forth, my gut is that about 1% of the population can accurately be described as entrepreneurs, as natural entrepreneurs. And the goal for entrepreneurship education, for accelerator programs and the like, is to move people along the spectrum because it's not binary. I have decided in my old age that entrepreneurship is a spectrum from, your entrepreneurial abilities, interests, skills, so on and so forth, sort of from 0 to 100. I mean, I used to think when I was growing up, my father was an entrepreneur, and I used to think that it was a job. I mean, he happened to be an entrepreneur in real estate, and so I figured you could be a firefighter, a police officer, a carpenter, or an entrepreneur. And then by the time I got to college, I realized this was not exactly the normal thing, and I started seeing entrepreneurs, some people being more self-starters than others. I realized that it really was a spectrum, a vector from, some people not at all entrepreneurial to people who are extremely entrepreneurial. If you look at a spectrum from my wife on the one hand, who is completely non-entrepreneurial, to Richard Branson on the other hand. And so I thought it was a spectrum. And then having spent now a lot of time investing and running on accelerators and so on and so forth, I've decided that it is a spectrum from 0 to 100, but from 0 to 99, it's a relatively smooth spectrum. And from that 99 to 100, that last 1%, there is an air gap. And that 1% is just literally psychiatrically different from, everybody else. They approach things differently innately. They have different risk tolerances. They think about starting and taking risk and responsibility in a different kind of way. So the goal for all these various entrepreneurship programs and books and everything else is to move people along the spectrum. So if you're somebody who is not at all entrepreneurial, if you get comfortable with entrepreneurship and understand how the process works and what these companies do and what the rewards and trade-offs are, then maybe at some point in your life you might work in a growth company. And if you're somebody who is sort of maybe curious about it, maybe you end up, working in a startup. And if you're somebody who's working in a startup and you get comfortable with the whole thing, maybe you end up being part of a founding team for a new company. And if you are that one person, that 1 out of 100 who really is one of these strange creatures, and once you go through all this education and accelerators and mentorship and support and blah, 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 then maybe you become a really, really good, Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or Richard Branson kind of thing. But it is that 1% that just thinks differently. And it's sort of like having, gaydar. You could put entrepreneurs in a room with other people, and we can figure out, who the other one is in the room. So,
David, you've given us a lot to unpack here. That was a tremendous answer to the first question. And I want to stay in this thread that you've opened up for us, but I want to go back to your history as an individual. And legend has it that you started your first company in some form or fashion at a very young age, like 10 years old.
Yeah, I was about 10 or 12 years old.
Okay.
It was Rose Productions, a multimedia organization. I even had business cards printed up because my brother was a magician who did birthday parties for kids in school. And our marketing department helped him to understand that, of course, every good performer required, business cards and brochures and posters and one-sheets and headshots and programs, and that Rose Productions, a multimedia organization, would be delighted to provide such high-quality materials to him. And that worked out very well for, a year or so, until my one client realized that the sum total of his revenues equaled the sum total of my revenues, and I lost my client. But continued to be a self-starter and start companies. In high school, I created a film program. I got the school to give me a room and one of the custodians as a projectionist, and I would go to these big catalogs of educational films from corporations and have them send us free films that we'd run for the kids. I sold battery additive. I got to college, realized that back in the dark ages, my dorm room actually had a working fireplace, but no firewood. So what do you have all these kids with fireplaces and no firewood? So my first day at school, I figured out how to get firewood. I had a whole truck come over with a cord of firewood, bought it wholesale, sold it retail. By the time I was finishing my college career, I was running the college print shop as an enterprise. When then as an entrepreneurial type, actually the school newspaper did a story that was headlined, if I recall correctly, this is back in the 1970s. David S. Rose, entrepreneur, or something with a question mark, like what is an entrepreneur? Because it was not at all as common then as it is now.
And that brings up an interesting point, and you alluded to this earlier. In some respects, it sounds like as a kid, you just thought this was something people could do. You didn't see it as different or dangerous or some kind of a leap. It was something your father was an entrepreneur, and it just, like you said, you'd be a policeman or a firefighter, you'd be an entrepreneur. Talk a little bit about that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like there's sort of a beneficial irrationality. I don't want to say ignorance, but you didn't know that was something that should be intimidating, ergo you just did it. Or is it some other process?
No, it's exactly that. But the interesting thing is that's not the way entrepreneurs think about it. In other words, when I'm saying that this 1% of people who just think differently from normal, regular, rational people. And so when I invest in somebody as an angel investor, the number one thing I look for is I'm betting on the person. Are you capital T, capital E, the entrepreneur? And in my book, The Startup Checklist, I devote several pages to discussing, what does that person look and smell and sound like? And that person, that part of the 1%, is, I consistently say that this is not better, it's just different, right? It's you have red hair. We think redheads are better, but okay, it's just different from you poor guys with dark hair. But every time I say entrepreneurs are just different, not better. One of my kids, who is probably at the 99% level, not the 100% level, gives me this withering glance and says, "Yeah, you say they're not better, but somehow they're responsible for changing the world. All good things come from entrepreneurs," and so on and so forth. but putting that aside, they really are different and just think differently. So, for example, no entrepreneur, nobody in that 1% would ever approach it with the same question that you were talking about, the trepidation or whatever. For them, it is as natural as breathing. I mean, I can no more think of not starting something as I could, whatever, think about not flying. Right? I mean, your natural inclination of me and every other entrepreneur I know is when you look around at the world, you see it as an opportunity. You see it as an opportunity to change. Things can be fixed. This can be done better. Oh, well, I can add value by doing X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's fact. But you mentioned my father. My entire family has been completely supportive since day one. I'm actually a fifth generation entrepreneur. So way, way back in family history when my great-great-grandfather left Eastern Europe because there was not a lot of output for entrepreneurial talent back then, ended up going to Corfu to grow citrons, esrubs that were used in for some religious holidays and stuff. Unfortunately, that crop failed, so that didn't work. So he then went to the Middle East, to what was then Palestine, and helped to start the citrus business in Palestine. And then eventually his grandchildren, or whatever it is, he sent his kids or his grandkids to the U.S., which was the land of opportunity. So my grandfather grew up on the Lower East Side, the streets of the Lower East Side, in Manhattan. And ultimately, he and my great uncle started a business. First, they started a laundry business. Then they started a construction business, turned into real estate. And then their sons, so my father, who back in the dot-com boom in '97 or thereabouts, I was a finalist for the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year award, which I was really very proud of. My father won it in 2003. So I mean, the guy's now 88. He's still doing stuff. I'm saying, get out of the way. There's another generation here.
Yeah, it's somebody else's turn. Well, I'm sure most of our listeners and viewers have read the book, but maybe not all. And you gave us a hint a moment ago that there are probably some defining characteristics, some identifiable traits that you could look at that would have if somebody is in that 100% entrepreneur category versus not quite there. Could you share a couple of examples? I mean, what does that look like, or what could somebody assess in themselves to see if they meet that description?
Sure. The first thing is, I think the most interesting thing for everybody, all of your listeners, is an interesting intellectual one. There was somebody on Quora a couple of years ago asked me what I thought about effectuation. I said, what the hell is that? Never heard of the term. So I looked it up and I found a website that was full of what seemed to me to be academic gibberish about how entrepreneurs think about different kinds of things. And I'm reading this page of literally gibberish, but as I was reading through it, I'm saying, okay, yeah, it's academic. Sounds like a professor of business who wouldn't know a business if it bit him in the nose. But there's something in here, so let me dig down a little bit. Turned out to be coming out of the Darden, University of Virginia Business School, as the result of the work of a professor who had been one of Milton Friedman's proteges. And it turns out that there is this whole new sort of discipline or area of academic interest called effectuation. And the website that for people who might want to check it out and put a link in the podcast is effectuation.org. And it discusses in great detail how entrepreneurs think, because what they would try to do is not say, how can you be a better entrepreneur or a good entrepreneur? Let's start out by just describing how that 1%, that weird kind of animal thinks. And just as one example, which I found completely accurate, if you think about having here's a problem, and here is you're trying to get to here, and you're trying to do it backwards over here. You're trying to get to here, and you're starting over here, and in the middle there's all this stuff. What do you do? Well, if you're a normal person and there's all this stuff that's sort of blocking it, you don't do anything. You stop. If you're an effective normal person, you say, okay, well, there's all this stuff over here, so I got to figure out how to sort of go around or over or dig a tunnel under or figure out how to get to the goal. If you're an entrepreneur, however, you think completely differently. You don't think about taking this and dealing with it. You say, okay, well, what if, that didn't exist? What if the world was just completely different and the world was the way I wanted it to be to get to this end and I can go right through, and then you change the world. And that is the fundamental difference. Entrepreneurs, do not start by saying, what are the obstacles that I have to overcome? They say, what would the world look like in the right way if the world should be there, and how do I get it there? And so that's one of the big sort of mental differences. And then beyond that, there's a comfort with risk. People look at entrepreneurs sort of like bungee jumpers or skydivers or whatever it is, and say, oh, you're taking all this kind of crazy risk. But for entrepreneurs, it's not risk at all. I mean, I am absolutely convinced I know what I'm doing. There's a chance it might work. There's always a question of luck and market and so on and so forth, competitors. But I don't see this as risky. I'm not gambling. I don't gamble at all, right? I don't go to casinos or even play poker. So I'm not interested in gambling. I'm interested in betting on myself. But that's a rational investment that I make. So entrepreneurs are willing to take risk, but they don't see it as risk the way regular people do. They are putting in enormous amounts of time and effort. I mean, I work, I probably sleep 5 hours a night or there. The rest of the time is working somehow, regarding what I'm doing. I haven't had a full vacation, as my family will tell you, in 10 years, which is, would be insane. So a couple of people once asked, wow, if only I could be David Rose. I said, well, if you want to be David Rose, you got to take the whole package, and believe me, you would not want it.
You don't want the whole thing. Well, it's interesting. I wonder then, and I suspect I know the answer, but to what degree can somebody learn to be an entrepreneur? If there's somebody listening going, well, gosh, I guess if I'm asking the question, that means I'm not it. Because David's point is that you either behave this way or you don't. So if you don't know, that's your answer. Can they improve? Can they get to a higher level of the scale? Yes. Or how should they react?
Yes. The answer is absolutely yes, because the whole goal of entrepreneurship education is to move people along the spectrum, right? And so while I will say that I think a part of it is, foregone, that 1%, whatever, genetic or something is there. I believe, actually, I'm not sure I should say this live on a podcast because it's going to be recorded and part of history forever. But in my secret heart of hearts, I probably think that the people who are at the 99 level are going to be likely more successful than the 100% entrepreneurs, because one of my kids is at the 99 level, and I'm at the 100, and my father's at the 100, and the three of us were sitting around talking about a business that we were doing together, we went through all these various things, and then the kid asked, okay, so if that doesn't work, what's plan B? My father and I looked at each other and said, plan B? What do you mean B? So I think in my heart of hearts, I know in my heart of hearts, you don't have to be that 100%, but you got to be pretty darn close, right?
Well,
and I think people who
100% can sometimes look like a compulsive behavior problem. You made a point earlier about not vacationing or sleeping very much, and it's part of a way of being that I doubt is optional for you. It's just what comes out of you and the expression of your personality and yourself. But one that, in your own words a moment ago, maybe isn't necessarily advisable. Like if somebody were to be.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting book. And so there are a couple of things that I've got stacked up here in the queue. I'm going to come back to in a minute, right? So one thing is a very interesting book called The Hypomanic Edge: How a Little Bit of Craziness Equals a Lot of Success in America. It's by a guy named John Gartner. You can put a link to that in the podcast as well. John was a professor at Hopkins, and for his in psychology, and for his I think graduate thesis, he did an analysis of religion and psychiatry. Right? Was Joan of Arc, did she hear the voice of God, or was she just schizophrenic? And so after he did that, he was looking for another group of people who might share similar characteristics. And he saw, as I recall, a cover of Newsweek of Bill Gross, the founder of Idea Lab. This was during the dot-com crash, and the headline was, "This man just lost $8 billion. Why is he smiling?" And he said, well, maybe, entrepreneurs are like this strange class as well. So he went into the diagnostic manual and looked for various kinds of symptoms or conditions that might result in that kind of an output. And he found something, and he sent around a little pilot survey to a bunch of very high-profile entrepreneurs. And he said, here are 17 characteristics. Could you just tell me on a scale of 1 to 5, do these tend to, do you recognize this or not? Speak fast, have a flood of ideas, not get a lot of sleep, always convinced you're right, not suffer fools gladly, all these things. And typically on those kind of pilot surveys, They say that if you get, off more than one standard deviation from the mean, it's meaningful. He said when he got back, he couldn't believe. It was like, 5, 5, 7, yes, this is me, all these things out there. And it turns out that these 17 symptoms are symptoms of a medical condition known as hypomania. And hypomania is from the Greek word hypo, meaning less than, and mania is the top end of manic depression or bipolar, or it's a psychopathy. And hypomania is less than mania, and is typically as part of a mood swing. If somebody is bipolar, you go down and up and down and up, and you go through sort of the midpoint to mania and come down again. So what Gartner said is, wait a minute, there may be something. I think he coined the term stable hypomania, which is people who sort of stop there. And what's really interesting is there are 17 symptoms for hypomania, and there are 17 symptoms for mania, and the symptoms are exactly identical with one difference. What do you think the difference is between hypomanics and manics?
Isn't it that hypomanics just stay up? There's not up and down variance.
That's part of it, how they get there. But in terms of looking at somebody and saying, okay, at this point, whether you're in a hypomanic phase or if you're manic or hypomanic,
Something tells me I'm witnessing it, but I'm not quite sure.
The difference is, the only diagnostic difference between hypomania and mania is that hypomanics are functional. So. Okay. If it's these same exact things, and if you can't actually function in life, then you're manic and you require medication and talk therapy and so on and so forth. But if you can actually function like this, then you're hypomanic. So for anybody who's interested in that, now, by the way, not all, and I also write this, I think discuss this in the book, not all hypomanics are entrepreneurs. Not all entrepreneurs are. Present very interesting crossover, among the two of them. And so what I have decided in living life as I do in a world of entrepreneurs and people who love them, hate them, fund them, work for them and go broke with them, is that hypomania or something like hypomania or close to it, you need to be hypomanic enough. And Malcolm Gladwell, book, he noted that, to be, widely successful, you don't have to be a super genius. You got to be smart enough, right? And you have to be hypomanic enough to have enough of this ability to be sure of yourself and self-confident and take risks and so on. But you also require a bunch of other things. And so that's why, there are not as many entrepreneurs in the world as there are probably hypomanics, because you need, I would posit, a society that lets you do it. If you are in a repressive totalitarian regime that doesn't allow for independent commercial activity, you're not going to be an entrepreneur. You're not going to have the full flowering. If you are in a society is equally permits it, but doesn't have the culture for it. For example, much of Western Europe, right, or to some sense South America. I mean, in the UK, if your business fails, you can't start another business for like 7 years. If you go bankrupt, people throw oranges at your kids in the street. Your family escutcheon is over. So there's not a culture that revels in it. You need to have role models, people who see. You need to be able to see a Richard Branson or Elon Musk or a Zuckerberg or whatever to say, hey, I want to be that. It's really helpful if you have a personal role model, somebody or who has seen. In my case, I have my father, but I have many others as well. Somebody you say, yeah, I want to be that person, and you can learn from them, right? And so you want to be in a society that has the appropriate regulation and bankruptcy laws and so on and so forth to encourage that. You put all that together, and that's the breeding pot for entrepreneurship.
The ecosystem. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I think that the challenge for somebody is to, first of all, figure out what you are. Do you feel internally that you need to go start something and do something? I mean, I joke that if you drop me on a desert island in the ocean, give me 2 days and I'll be selling coconuts to seagulls or something, right? I mean, that's just what I do. On the other hand, there are people, because this is the spectrum, and there is the other 99%. It doesn't mean those 99% should are unable to and shouldn't start companies. But what it, and the 99 is probably better at doing this than the 100%. But understand what entrepreneurship is. The whole effectuation stuff, which has gotten very little shrift outside of academia, is actually quite interesting in telling you and describing how entrepreneurs think and how that mindset works. But then there's another really good book. So I think there are two books that I would recommend for people who are sort of starting in this world. One of them is my own book. It's called The Startup Checklist, 25 Steps to a Scalable High-Growth Business. And that's designed for entrepreneurs who know they want to start a company, and the question is, how do you do it? And it lays out in 25 steps, bump, 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 bump. This is exactly what you do. And to my astonishment, Wiley asked me to write this book after my first book on angel investing became a New York Times bestseller. And they said, wait a minute, there are not enough angel investors to make a book a New York Times bestseller. So who the hell is buying the book? It's
an interesting point. I hadn't considered that.
It turned out to be bought by entrepreneurs who wanted to see how they raise money from angel investors, right? So they said, well, why don't you do a book for entrepreneurs? Tell them how to raise money. And by the way, I started, and I said, there are, 94, luckily on Amazon, 94,000 books in the whole starting a company kind of thing. So I don't think you need another one. But as they pointed out, what was really interesting, about half of those books have been around for a while, and those are books about how to start a small business, a typical American small business, a hot dog stand, a yoga studio, a restaurant, whatever. And they're all great. They're sort of very recipe cookie cutter books as to here's what you do. And then there's a whole other suite of books started about 10, 15 years ago. Guy Kawasaki, The Art of the Start, was one of the first of them. These days, you've got Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, and Eric Ries, the Lean Startup Methodology, of course, Steve Blank, The Startup Owner's Manual. But those are all, and I know all those guys, and they're all great, and the books are great, and the guys are great. But those are all sort of high concept books about how, what's the theory of a lean startup? What's entrepreneurship? The E-Myth Revisited, great book. What's entrepreneurship all about? But none of them actually tell you how to go do it. What's the difference between an LLC and a Delaware C Corp? What's the how do you split equity and so on and so forth? What does your lawyer do for you? So that turned out there was nothing, zero about that. So that's why I wrote the book, and it turned out it's the only book in the category. To my absolute astonishment, it turned out that since it was the only book in the category, it's now about a year and a half in, has been adopted by over 500 universities in the U.S. as their standard textbook for how to start a company, because it's the only one. So having done that, that's the first book I recommend, obviously. But the second book is a book that came out earlier this year by Jeff Busgang, and it's called Entering Startup Land. And that book is a really good book also, and it's aimed at somebody who's not the 1%. It explains what the whole startup world is all about, and it's not a cookie cutter saying you are an entrepreneur to go do this. It's, hey, you can work in a startup, and here are all these other roles and jobs and places you can, get your feet wet and so on and so forth. Understand the culture. So I would say his book is designed for, the next 49%. After mine. And I would strongly suggest I put a link for that in the podcast as well.
We certainly will. And David, now that we've learned a bit about your very productive hypomania and given us a lot to think about from our own personalities, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about Gust and how you're channeling all that energy today. What are you up to, and what does that word mean?
Sure. So Gust was set up, given my background as a serial entrepreneur. So just to give you the 15-second or 30-second abbreviated version of the 3-hour David S. Rose life story, having started at 10 and got into college and all that kind of stuff, I then got out of college with no idea of what I wanted to do. My friends were going to be a surgeon, or they were going to be in the management training program at Bloomingdale's or a lawyer or whatever. I had no idea. So I actually applied to Disney to be an Imagineer to design rides at Disney World, and also to get a master's in type design and typography, which is my other passion, in Florence. And as I was waiting to hear about that, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I had done some volunteer work for and knew, offered me the job as his urban affairs expert, because I actually had a degree in urban planning and urban affairs. So I said, okay, fine, that sounds good. So my first career was in government, working for Pat Moynihan as his urban affairs expert, and having an enormous amount of fun for a 21-year-old kid. And after 2 years, I realized that I was one of these entrepreneur kind of guys, a private sector guy. So I reluctantly left Moynihan, went back to B school, got an MBA in real estate finance, went into the real estate business, my father initially, and then moved off into the startup world. So given all of that history, the little startup I started got really big. It got very, very big. Got a lot of VC. Fell backwards into it. The only person I ever know who raised VC money, not realizing he was raising VC money. Company got to be 125 people and then totally crashed and burned and evaporated, which was not pleasant. But we restarted because we hit the dot-com boom at that point, and so we went from 125 to 17 to 75. Did another round of venture financing and got to be at this point a multinational, operations in the UK, France, Germany, all kinds of stuff. Then along came the dot-com crash, which followed the dot-com boom, and all of a sudden it was a non-existent company again. Long, painful story there. At which point there's a sort of sequence of authority in a company. You've got the managers, the direct, the CXOs, the board, the chairman of the board, and then there's the spousal authority. And so at that point, the spousal authority revoked my entrepreneurship card, so I wasn't allowed to go play anymore. So I was taken off the field, and all I could do was become an investor. So that's when I became an investor, and did that for a number of years. And then since old habits die hard, I ended up starting an angel group, New York Angels, and associate founder of Singularity University out in Silicon Valley. And along the way, began to learn not only the investing side of the business, but also looking at the future of technology and stuff. And it became apparent to me that there was a way to apply there should be a way to apply technology to these crazy worlds in which I was operating as an entrepreneur, as an angel investor, and so on and so forth. And said, imagine what would happen if you could take all of these. If you say it's 1% of the world, and there are 100 million, where 10 billion people we're heading out to, that's 100 million potential entrepreneurs out there, in the world. If you could somehow harness 100 million entrepreneurs plus the billions of people who can invest in them and fund innovation, so on and so forth, that would be amazingly cool and great for society and make a lot of money and so on and so forth. The problem is, historically, all of the technology had been applied to, picosecond trading with public equities or, payment processing for credit cards, but not for this entrepreneurial world. So the goal was to see if you could apply technology to this world of early stage entrepreneurs and the people who fund them. And so I figured that would take, ultimately rebuilding the entire global financial world to do, which is a bit much to bite off, but that's okay. I'm an entrepreneur. That's what we do. So I set out to change the entire financial world with a 15-year business plan, The only problem is, no rational entrepreneur would, start a 15-year business plan. No rational investor would fund a 15-year business plan. But luckily, if you combine a crazy entrepreneur and a crazy investor in the same package, you do it. So we set out on a path to do that. And I started the company that's now Gust to do a 15-year business plan to rebuild the entire world on the basis of entrepreneurship and people who fund them. And so it's been now 13 and a half years. We haven't pivoted. We're on target. And so, give me another couple of years and you'll see the entire world rebuilt around entrepreneurs.
I can't wait. I can't wait.
Well, the question, therefore, your next question should be, okay, so what the heck are you doing and how do we actually help entrepreneurs? Yeah. And so the answer to is we started out by connecting all these entrepreneurs and all the companies, the investors who invest in them. So we started out paradoxically with the investor side, the entrepreneurs, the angel investor side. So we went out to all the world's angel investors and said, hey, we'll create a platform to let you manage your whole process of hearing pitches and investing in companies. And so long story short, today we power a majority of the world's angel investor groups with effectively a CRM system that they use to take in applications for funding, do their diligence, run the deal book for the deal, and so on and so forth. So that in turn got us all these entrepreneurs who were applying to them for funding, and then we opened it up for the entrepreneurs to create a platform for them to create a profile on Gust at no cost, where they could put all their investor information in, share it with these investors, angel groups, and VC funds, and so on and so forth, as well as individual angel investors and the like. And then we expanded from there to other organizations and people who were dealing with same kind of issues: accelerator programs, incubators, seed funds, entrepreneurship support programs, and so on and so forth. So today, now 13 years into this excellent adventure, it may surprise you to realize that we have over 600,000 companies on Gust today. We are back-ending effectively the CRM and internal systems for over 2,500 investment organizations, including angel groups and venture funds and accelerator programs and so on and so forth. Because of that, because we aggregate all this together, we now have over 10,000 companies every month who come on to Gust and put their own investor-related information onto the platform. So that gives us, in turn, the scale and scope, because this was international from day one. So we now have entrepreneurs in 191 countries. I did not know there were 191 countries, who are doing this. Investors in 157 countries. We've processed over $1 billion in applications for funding, in funding, actually, people who have invested in these companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so having done all that, and then having written the book about how to start a company, we then began to put the whole thing together, the platform, the software, the information, what we know about how to start a company. And a little less than a year ago, we released the culmination of all this, which is a new platform called Gust Launch, gust.com/launch. Look in the show notes for that as well. What that is, it's a SaaS business, a software as a service business that is actually so disruptive and so new. We coined a new term for it, but we've actually filed a trademark on, which is company as a service, a CaaS. And so now, if you are a startup and you are wondering, you decided you are an entrepreneur, you have a vision, you have an idea for what you want to do, and now, like all the rest of us, well, okay, what do I do now? Because nobody ever teaches you in high school, college, business school, anywhere, how to start a company. And so now, luckily, you've got the company as a service, which is Gust Launch. So now you come on to Gust Launch, and you press the button, and you say, go. And what happens? Well, let's see. We incorporate you as a Delaware C Corp, which is what you should do if you are want to be a high-growth company. We serve as your registered agent in Delaware. Gust is a Delaware registered agent. We file you with the IRS for your EIN, your employer identification number. We foreign qualify you in your home state so you can do business operating there. We do all your post-incorporation legal setup and structuring, write your bylaws, your incorporation and action sole incorporator, and so on and so forth. We do all your board structuring, set up your board, set up your cap table to decide so you can figure out who owns the company, handle your stock issuances, issue stock to your founder, handle things like 83B elections, investing schedules, spousal consent, all that kind of stuff. Next, a Slack channel design of other entrepreneurs, starting up for peer support and the like. And the total cost for all of this, $300. So, at that point, this is now so completely disruptive that it's almost an IQ test, right? If you want to be a high growth, seriously, if you want to be a high growth entrepreneur and start a company, you can either, spend, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 on lawyers and everything else and do it the wrong way, end up with a New Jersey LLC that you have to, end up redoing something eventually. Or you can spend $300 and do it the right way. It gives you a solid foundation. And then from there, it goes on for the rest of your career as an entrepreneur and through additional add-on packages and as you grow up the system, all at equally disruptive price points. It handles everything from your option plan to giving you options to providing your lawyer and your accountant and your bookkeeper and your online accounting software. It handles your outsourcing. It handles your fundraising. It handles all that kind of stuff. So what we have done with Gust is to create Gust Launch, which is the first true company as a service. And the really cool thing about it is you're probably familiar with NPS scores, Net Promoter Scores, which indication of how happy customers are. The range goes from sort of right now Facebook at a -21 these days to Wikipedia at like a 50, and the world class is the Apple iPhone at a 70. Our NPS scores for people using Gust Launch, 71. Total. So we have company, the customers who do it love it. It's the best way to get started. You hold your hand, you do it the right way, and you have the foundation for growing a business that ultimately will inure to the benefit of investors, because they will now have rational, solid companies done the right way, structured the right way, with the right tools and services to make it easier to get companies financed. And so with that base, give me another 2 years and we'll change the whole world.
So if you're listening or watching, you may not have the characteristics of 100% born to be entrepreneur, but you can improve. But anyone listening or watching can pass the IQ test and do the obvious and intelligent thing and use Gust Launch to their entrepreneurship.
But John, let me go back. As I said, as my kid points out, that it sounds when I say it like the only good people are entrepreneurs and so on and so forth, and that really isn't the case, because I have seen too many people who are not that 1%, but are the 99 or the 98 or the 95 or the 90, right? It doesn't mean you can't do it.
Oh, no.
And you should do it. And many of the world's greatest businesses were started not by people who are, Tim Cook is not an entrepreneur.
You
right?
could probably be thankful if you're not 100. It's a stressful way to live. It's fun, but it's busy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I happen to very much enjoy what I am and who I am, but I will tell you, it wreaks havoc on your family. It wreaks havoc on friends, and it's not something necessarily you should wish for.
Well, we enjoy it too. David S. Rose. We've introduced some links, some books. We'll put it in the show notes. But to honor your request at the beginning, we will simply identify you as entrepreneur at sign off. So, David, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Southpod, Rise of a Region, where innovators dish on success, failure, and a rapidly evolving South.